Okay, because we're talking about how to solve quadratic equations, and every once in a while when we use that quadratic formula, like we talked about the last video, we can end up with negative numbers inside the square root right here. That means we better be prepared to deal with those negative numbers. So we're going to talk about complex numbers, and this is just a basic introduction to complex numbers. You've probably heard it before in Algebra 2, but hey, you know what? Let's cover it again. The main thing that we know is that the square root of -1, you've learned this before, we're going to call I instead. And so there's all sorts of circumstances where we can use this I. So for instance, you know the square root of 4. The square root of 4 is just 2. So now what we're going to do is if you see the square root of -4, we're going to say that's the same thing as the square root of -1 times the square root of +4, right? We can say that negative 4, let's break it up into -1 and +4. And now we can just call this right here I, and this right here 2. So the square root of -4 is 2i. Looks familiar, right? Square root of +4 is 2. Square root of -4 is 2i. The square root of 9 is 3. You know that. So the square root of -9 is, can you guess? 3i, right? Okay, so whenever we see a negative sign, we just pull it out front. We don't worry. It doesn't change the value. Look, the 9 still became a 3, right? So we can do it as big as we want to. Square root of -100, that's just going to be 10. Now we throw an I at the end. Now an interesting thing about this is the fact that if we have I squared, that really means, remember, I is the square root of -1, and we're going to square it. And as we know, squares and square roots cancel each other out. So what happens is the square root and the square go away. I'm left with just the -1. If you ever see an I squared, it's just a -1. So something like 3i squared, if that happens to show up, well, that's just really 3 times a -1, which we know is a -3. So in other words, the 3 doesn't change, but the I squared I pull out front as a negative sign. If I had a -4i squared, that becomes a +4. It flips the sign, the number does not change. And then the last thing is this. We can have a mixture of real and imaginary numbers, and we call this a complex number. Complex, okay? It has a part that doesn't have an I, that's the real part, and it has an imaginary part that does have an I. So anytime we have a mixture of them, say something like this, 3i plus 2, that's really the improper way to write it. We always want to write the real thing first, and then the imaginary part is second. So we would rewrite it in this format. You're going to see A plus BI format, and that's all it means. Put the thing with the I last. Okay, if that makes sense, then we're going to talk in the next video about having to solve an equation that has complex roots. We'll talk about what to do when you get a negative inside the square root sign.